Welcome to Beyond Today's Headlines. I'm Brad LaPlante. A 2023 study by the American Psychological Association found that family conflict was the 8th highest source of stress for people during the holidays. A 2022 survey by YouGov revealed that more than a quarter of Americans were estranged from at least one family member. With the holidays approaching and given the tense political climate this year, I figured it would be a good time to talk about family estrangement, and so I talked with Dr. Joshua Coleman. He's a psychologist and the author of Rules of Estrangement.
I think there's a number of different pathways. If you look at the surveys of adult children, what they commonly say is that it's due to emotional abuse on the parents' part, differences in values, physical abuse. But if you talk to the parents, you get a very different narrative. Certainly, while some acknowledge that there was physical or emotional abuse, more commonly the pathways are divorce on the part of the parents, sometimes divorce on the part of the adult child, mental illness certainly on the parents' part, but also on the part of the adult child. When the adult child marries, that can become a flashpoint towards estrangement. If the parent doesn't like who the child is marrying, or that child doesn't like the parents and says, choose them or me, you can't have both. Therapy today, I think, is a common pathway where a therapist may rightly or wrongly attribute the dysfunction in the adult child, depression, anxiety, problems with relationships, etc., to parental traumas or their perception of parental traumas. And that can also green light a pathway towards estrangement, or they can even encourage an estrangement as a way to protect the adult child's mental health. Sometimes the adult child doesn't know any other way to feel separate from the parent. So those are the main pathways, I would say. Although another one that's more recent, I did a survey with the Harris poll, and we found that 20% of people are estranged over just political differences at this point, and that's pretty new historically. I mean, we've had that data since 2016, but in 2016 it was more like 16%, and now we're seeing more like 20%. So, general, kind of the affective polarization that comes from political differences is also infecting family relationships too.
That's really interesting. And how does estrangement impact the individuals and the family members involved?
Right. Well, I mean, the adult children, if you look at the surveys from their experience, they often will say that they feel better, they feel less stressed, it feels better for their mental health, et cetera. They feel happier. Whereas for the parents, you get really the opposite. You get parents who say they feel suicidal, they feel depressed, they feel like they've lost all sense of meaning and purpose, particularly those who are cut off from their grandchildren, which is typically a consequence of an estrangement. Typically today, if an adult child cuts off contact with a parent, they also deny access to the grandchildren. An estrangement is a cataclysmic event in a family system. So if an adult child cuts off a parent, it almost always affects sibling relationships, because some siblings will ally with the estranged adult child, others with the parent. Other people may step in to fill the parental role. As I mentioned earlier, grandparents get cut off from grandchildren. So it's a serious event in a family system.
How does if somebody cuts off a family member, they're thinking about cutting off a family member, how do you deal with the guilt, or how do they deal with the guilt or the shame that might come with that decision?
Yeah, well, I think they often go to therapy or they seek self-help. And, therapists have become what the sociologist Alison Pugh calls detachment brokers, meaning that therapists have sort of facilitated feeling less guilty or ashamed. And, in our highly individualistic therapeutic culture, there is a great emphasis on one's own happiness and well-being and the like. And so everything kind of is secondary towards the preservation of that. So I think most people seek therapy. But just to back up for a minute from my earlier point, the one place where the parent may be in less pain than the adult child is when the parent's the one who initiated the estrangement. And I see that sometimes, particularly in tight religious communities, where if the adult child goes off the derrick, they decide that they don't want to practice the religion that the parents practice, and the parents may disown them. Some parents will disown the child because of their sexuality or gender identity. So in those cases, it's more likely that the adult child is suffering because they're the ones who really want the connection, and they feel both shamed and rejected and isolated.
It's usually the one who has not the initiator, the one who is being cut off that feels the worst.
More typically, yeah, there's no upside for them. Whereas for the person who's doing it, they can feel like, well, I'm protecting my mental health, I'm advancing my own narrative about my identity, etc. Whereas for the person who's being rejected, it's just all loss and shame.
Dr. Coleman at one point was estranged from his own daughter. And so I asked him what that was like and how he moved towards reconciliation.
I mean, initially I dealt with it poorly, which I think is what caused the estrangement. You know, I was married and divorced in my 20s, and my daughter's in her 40s, and we are very close now and have been for years. But there was a period of time in her early 20s where she wanted to talk about what she felt like growing up in a blended family, how she felt in many ways displaced after I became remarried and had more children in my current marriage of many years, and feeling, you know, in some ways like she didn't really have the same kind of secure, loving environment that my boys were raised with, which is a really, you know, in hindsight, a very fair perception. But at the time, I responded more defensively and probably negatively in certain ways, and which of course just drove her further away. So it really wasn't until I realized I had to stop doing that and to really just try to be empathic and more deeply understand what her experience was and take responsibility and not keep trying to explain my way out of it, that things began to turn around. So once we were reconciled, I realized that there was a need for better advice about that. There really wasn't any advice at the time. So I wrote my first book on the topic in 2007, When Parents Hurt, and as a result of that, got a wide following of estranged parents here and in other Anglophone countries. And as a result of that, started doing a webinar series, which I've been doing for the past 17 years every Tuesday, and a free Q&A, which I do every other Monday, because I just couldn't handle the volume of questions that I would get. And then did a survey of 1,600 parents to the University of Wisconsin Survey Center and published that in numerous academic journals. And then wrote my more recent book, Rules of Estrangement, based on, you know, all the families that I'd seen over the past 18 years and also the research that I did.
In your own relationship with your daughter, you mentioned, you know, how your divorces played a pretty large role. I'm wondering, what role does trauma or past abuses, what role does that play?
Well, yeah, I think that for today, adult children, children who were abused or traumatized by their parents, they either don't feel as motivated to reconcile or have a relationship with a parent, or they want to work it through with the parent, and not all parents are able to navigate that. And part of the challenging part is that there's kind of a generational difference over what constitutes abuse and harm and trauma and neglect. And so younger generations have been raised with, you know, a sort of a lower threshold for what gets defined as that, whereas older generations, you know, were sort of raised in an era where things that are called traumatic or particularly emotional abuse today, which is probably the biggest thing that parents get accused of, just wasn't really on anybody's radar in the way that it is now. So often there's a generational talking past each other. So I feel like a lot of my work is helping parents to understand how to address these issues in a way that causes their adult child to feel seen and heard and understood, because they're just sort of growing up in a different culture, and to not get into the rightness or wrongness or accuse their child of being overly sensitive or a snowflake or whatever, but rather to assume that if they're raising issues of childhood, that they're doing it to try to have a better relationship with the parent, to be closer with them, and or have a better relationship with themselves, which is our duty as parents to be motivated around that as well.
This seems like a very white person or white cultured thing, right? Or problem, because when I've talked to friends or colleagues that are of Latin American descent,
Yep.
or who are Black, family is very, very, very important to them.
Yep.
Whereas it's not as emphasized in at least my family growing up.
Yeah.
So what how is it different across cultures and across generations?
No, you're absolutely right. And in a survey done by my colleague at Ohio State, Ren Resnick, she found that 26% of fathers are currently estranged, 6% of mothers, but black mothers are in many ways the least likely to be estranged, whereas black fathers are in many ways the most likely to be estranged. And I think there's similar statistics around Latino mothers were, I think lower rates of estrangement than white mothers. Fathers also are at a higher risk of estrangement. So I agree with you that it is in many ways a Euro American problem. You're right that Latin American culture emphasizes familism, this idea that the family is so core. And also it's fairly rare, even though I see more and more people in my practice who are from South and East Asian cultures. They're still the vast minority. It's still predominantly a white Euro-American problem, and I think there are probably whole continents where it barely, either doesn't exist at all. Like when I talk to colleagues, who work in India or China or South Korea, or even in some of the European countries, particularly in Italy, for example, people are just like, that's insane. Why would you cut off your parent? So the idea that this is considered sort of a virtuous thing to do or a pathway towards mental health in the way it's currently characterized among white families isn't really nearly as popular in other cultures and societies, even within the United States.
What steps do you think that individuals can take or what are the first steps if they want to reconcile the relationship?
I mean, it's typically on the part of the parent, because for the adult child, it's working for them, and nothing compels an adult child to have a relationship with the parent beyond that adult child's desire to have a relationship. So the old days of honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, families forever, at least to our point, and the point we're making, at least amongst white families, is much less. It isn't really a motivator anymore. So the idea that you can kind of guilt trip your child into being in relationship to you, or tell them how much you've done for them, or how much of a better childhood you gave than the one that you had, it's just not going to be a motivator. Relationships are based much more on what the British sociologist Anthony Giddens calls pure relationships, meaning that they're purely constituted on the basis of whether or not the relationship is in line with my ideals for happiness, identity, personal growth, and protection of my mental health. So parents have to be motivated and able to navigate that space. And to that extent, it requires much more psychological awareness and commitment on the part of parents than was true of other generations, where the standards of engagement, particularly re-engagement, weren't so high. So that requires that the parent be able to take responsibility, show empathy, not be defensive, not guilt trip, not criticize, really make the relationship. It's really the very same environment that romantic relationships are based upon these days. People either marry or divorce on the basis of whether or not that relationship is in line with their ideals for happiness and personal growth. And if they're not, then people get the hell out. And the similar is the case for parent-adult-child relationships from the adult child's perspective. If it's not in line with my ideals for happiness or mental health, why would I bother? So it just means that it's much more incumbent on parents, because the adult child isn't going to be as motivated to, because the estrangement's kind of working for them.
If you are the parent, what do you think? What's your advice for them as far as if they really want to navigate this, but maybe they don't know how, or the adult child is not as receptive? What is your advice to them?
Yeah, my first advice is to start with a letter of amends and open it with, I know you wouldn't do this unless you felt like it was the healthiest thing for you to do. Now, it's not going to feel like the healthiest thing for their child to do from the parent's perspective, but the adult child wouldn't be doing it unless they thought it was the healthiest thing for them to do. So it's a way to kind of get on the same page, and rather than acting victimized or martyred by the estrangement, which is, parents always feel kind of hurt and victimized by it, but rather than making it about them, making it about the adult child's experience. If they don't understand, and not all parents do, sometimes because they just can't accept the reasons that the adult child is given, other times because the adult child actually hasn't provided them with an explanation. But to say it's clear that I have significant blind spots as a person or as a parent, that I don't have a better understanding of why you need to do this, but I would like to know, would you feel comfortable writing me or telling me more about why you feel like this is in your best interest, or I promise to read or listen purely to listen and not defend myself. If there are things you'd like me to work on in my own therapy, or if there are things you'd like to work on with me in family therapy, I'd welcome that as well. Hope you'll let me know. Love, Mom, Dad, etc.
And at what point do you think it is healthier for individuals to maintain estranged or consider reconciling?
I mean, I think people should never be permanently estranged. That's sort of my wish, sort of the societal level. People, parents can grow and change and mature over time. So maybe you do need to take a 6-month or even a year break. But what about, at the end of that year, checking back in and asking the parent if they're willing to consider the relationship, but on different terms. So part of my wish is that people didn't just do this permanently because of the absolute immiseration that it causes on the part of the parent and the grandparent. But there are some parents, who are completely unrepentant, who just refuse to kind of get with the program, who remain critical and shaming and humiliating of the adult child, whether it's about their religion or gender identity or sexuality or who they are as a person, and that costs the adult child so much psychologically that they just feel like it's not worth the freight. Now, I will say that the caveat to that is that I feel like as a culture we become way too sensitive. And so I think that dividing line, that threshold for tolerable versus intolerable feelings of discomfort or conflict has really been lowered. And I would, again, it's sort of my societal wish is that people would be more oriented towards engagement rather than disengagement to protect themselves. But I do think that there's a case for people to stop trying, certainly for some period of time, because some parents are just so unwilling to meet very reasonable requests on the part of the adult child.
That was Dr. Joshua Coleman. Rules of Estrangement can be purchased at Penguin Random House. The music you heard today was by Rage. My name is Brad LaPlante, and I will see you next week.